Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Cooper, briefing Trump and his national security team in the White House today on what options the U.S. has to extract Trump from his maniacal misadventure in the Middle East. Joining us to discuss a way out as oil prices spike at $126 a barrel and the new supreme leader vows to protect Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities is Karen Greenberg, a future security fellow at the New America Foundation and co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy, From the War on Terror to Donald Trump. Then we'll go to Kyiv, Ukraine, to speak with Tamar, Jacoby, the director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page. She's the author of Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience, and we'll discuss how yesterday Trump checked in with the boss in an hour-and-a-half phone call with Putin, and Tamar's article at the Washington Monthly, The U.S.-Europe Rift, How Trump's Iran War is Making It Worse. Then finally we'll assess the second day of Secretary Hegseth's testimony, this time before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and speak with Tom Mockaitis, a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European, and military history. His research and writing covers international security, terrorism, unconventional conflict, and military history. A regular contributor to The Hill, he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as part of the United States Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and is the author of many books including New Terrorism, Myths and Reality, and Violent Extremists, Understanding the Domestic and International Terrorist Threat. And he has a recent article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. And joining us now is Karen Greenberg, a future security fellow at the New America Foundation and co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy, From the War on Terror to Donald Trump. Welcome to Background Briefing, Karen Greenberg.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, Karen. And today it's crunch time for Trump's maniacal misadventure in the Persian Gulf, because there's a meeting in the White House Situation Room today where CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper briefed Trump and his national security team, such as it is, laying out the options, none of which are good. At the same time, Iran's new supreme leader vowed in a message that was read on Iranian TV, a defiant statement that basically said that the Islamic Republic would protect its nuclear and missile capabilities, and taunted again the great Satan. So this doesn't look good. I imagine the choices and what leaks we've seen are that either you have a long blockade, which will obviously cause the price of get oil to spike even higher, and it came just overnight. Brent crude was $126 a barrel. Mm-hmm. So imagine how much worse that will get. So that doesn't seem like an attractive option for Trump and the Republicans. And the other one, of course, is what apparently Brad Cooper's discussed today, which is a plan prepared by CENTCOM to include a wave of short and powerful strikes intended to force Iran back to the negotiating table. So what do you think will be the decision here?
Oh, my goodness. It's hard for me to say what will be the decision. I don't believe the United States has that many choices. I mean, I don't think walking away is a choice at this part. There's too much that lies on the table that has to be decided at this point in terms of, what the next steps are militarily, what the next steps are in terms of the strait, etc. So I think that the word quagmire, which was used yesterday, much to the arousing the anger of the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, is something we're thinking about right now, because I think the question is, how can the United States proceed without this looking more and more like a quagmire? And in terms of coming to the negotiation table, as you've seen over the past week, there's been Trump says he won't come to the negotiation table. The Iranians, however, went home first. So the question is, who's not coming to the negotiation table, and what will it take to get negotiations restarted? What country will need to intervene? What incentives will need to be put on the table?
Well, Mujtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, who has apparently been in intensive care for some time, the word is that he's out. His face is disfigured. He's lost a leg and he's in pretty bad shape. But he hasn't gone public. The Iranians are saying the reason is, of course, that the minute he raises his head, the Israelis will try and strike him. So we don't quite know about who's running the show. The reports that I've been looking into indicate that General Vahidi, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, might well be the real power behind the scenes. And he's a horrible guy, by the way, a murderous, hideous character. But the statement that came out today from Mujtaba Khamenei was marking Persian Gulf Day. So happy Persian Gulf Day, Karen.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, look, a lot of this has to do with, how is it unexpected that the IRGC would be, running the country in this way after this war started? I don't think so. And the question is, how many of the things that have developed were actually put on the table ahead of time in White House meetings, National Security Council meetings, et cetera. And again, I know this has been said by others in the past, but the lack of anticipation and preparing for what might come seems to be quite profound. And it's almost like the United States look like a deer in the headlights. What do we do with the situation that we, participated in launching? And now what do we do for the next steps? And there seems to be this kind of surprise, a little bit of outrage by what's going on in Iran at top levels. But what exactly was expected? What is, as with the Strait of Hormuz, was that really a surprise? And so I think, every single day, no matter what we hear, we're left with what was anticipated and what was the response put on the table then. And unfortunately, the answer often seems to be, well, that wasn't anticipated. Something else was anticipated, or maybe nothing was anticipated. Maybe there really was this sense that Iran would capitulate right away, which is completely not what is happening.
But when you've got the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, in the Situation Room today, briefing the president and his so-called national security team, the reason I say the so-called is that there is no national security process anymore in this White House. And if there were, you would have had the Iranian experts weighing in saying this is a bad idea. But they just don't exist. And you've got Secretary of State Marco Rubio wearing two hats, supposedly both Secretary of State and head of the National Security Council. But you don't have the normal process. And I guess, Brad Cooper is somebody that seems to know how to handle the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as he likes to call himself, because he sort of pretends to be one of these war fighters and plays to Hegseth's infantile notion of the warrior culture. So, I don't have any faith in these people coming up with anything reasonable, because the system has been eviscerated to the point where there are no adults in the room to say this is a bad idea. We wouldn't be in this predicament but for the fact that the place has been purged.
No, I think this is actually such a good point, and it's often overlooked by commentators, which is that basically the national security state as we knew it was intentionally, like so much of the government under this administration, dismantled. And that is a problem. And whether it's wearing two hats, like you just referred to with Marco Rubio, or whether it's just taking people out of the process who disagree, or whether it's just eradicating institutional knowledge. And one of the things is there is a deep bench of individuals, experts, people who have served in government at one level or another, who understand Iran deeply, including people who worked on the original JCPOA under Obama. There are both in the military and outside of the military. And the fact that these voices aren't included just to hear what they have to say, just to hear who they know in Iran and what they may be intending and what the alliances are and how money flows and how weapons flow. And they've taken those voices out of the mix. And it's an extremely dangerous situation to be in, as if knowledge is a problem rather than knowledge is something that can get us to a safer outcome. So I'm so happy that you were highlighting that.
Well, if we had reporting and intelligence coming out of Iran, I think we probably know. First of all, the irony is that the day before the US and Israelis attacked and killed the supreme leader and a lot of the leadership, that was the weakest point that the Islamic Republic was in, because its people are so furious with them. They murdered, 10, 20, 30,000. We don't quite know what the figure is. You can see that they're incredibly defensive. But now, of course, things have turned around, and you've got this horrible General Vahidi running the place. And you don't want to get bombed by the Americans and the Israelis, but on the other hand, you also don't want to get shot by your own government if you go out on the street. So what a predicament. Now, just in terms of anecdotal information, the Daily Telegraph sent a guy out in a boat into the Straits of Hormuz, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing was hundreds and hundreds of small boats coming from the Iranian side across to Oman, smuggling gasoline because it's subsidized by the Iranian government to placate the public. And then they resell it in Oman, and then buy, goods that you can't get, like, Tampax and toilet paper and whatever else, medicines, And there's this thriving, in the midst of this huge war, there's this thriving underground economy going on. Yeah. I think that indicates something broader, doesn't it?
It does, but it also indicates, this, I don't know if there's a better word for it, but the degree to which necessity in terms of human beings and how they live their lives, and what it's not just economic, it's what that arrangement that you're talking about is addressing, which are human needs and human necessities. And so it's not surprising, actually, that kind of arrangement has emerged, and it could be replicated in other ways that we don't know about. But in terms of the larger picture, it's not gonna, I don't think, really. It's an interesting anecdote, as you say, but doesn't really get to the heart of the larger picture and how this is going to be decided, if in fact it's going to be decided in any timely fashion.
Well, evidence of the blockade is not very encouraging. According to the Middle East Monitor, 52 Iranian ships have breached the U.S. blockade within 72 hours. Yeah. So if that's our leverage over them to further destroy their economy in the hope that somehow you get this zealot government to, change its mind, I'm not even sure that the tools that we're using are particularly effective.
Right. And it also gets to the question of how do you define winning? Is not losing, is not losing equivalent to winning? In terms of is not capitulating the same thing as winning? And that really is where we get to on the Iran. What is the outcome? What is the intended outcome at this point? Yes, I understand. We understand that it's eradication of the nuclear capability of Iran. But what does that exactly mean? Especially when Hegseth has now articulated before the Congress that it's about nuclear ambitions, not necessarily about the full-blown nuclear reality, which I think is a very interesting sort of sleight of hand that he made yesterday in his testimony.
Well, but didn't that have echoes of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud that they kept repeating?
Yeah.
He kept repeating it forever in refusing to answer questions. All he said was, do you want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Well,
Exactly. Right.
I mean,
No matter what came up, he kept saying, every time a congressperson would say, look at what this is costing in terms of food, in terms of gas, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of, living conditions for people in the United States, he would say, just what you said. Well, would you rather, you want to have a nuclear disaster? You want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Do you realize what that would mean? And so it's the only response. And as you're right, it's the mushroom cloud response and building on this and totally taking the idea of the legacy of negotiation in the nuclear space off of the table. And I don't mean negotiation for just this conflict. I mean the larger issue of diplomacy, negotiation, and the role it can play. And when you talk about the demise of the national security apparatus, one of the things I keep waiting to hear is where are the tried and true diplomats that we've relied on for so long, and how do we get them into the mix and not just have people who are appointed who the president has by his side who are close advisors. And I just very worries me that the Department of Defense is running the show rather than the broader national security apparatus.
Well, it's also the person who's really running the show is Donald Trump, and his military and diplomatic advice appears to be good as his medical advice was in his first term, when he recommended the way to get rid of COVID was to drink bleach and flash a UV light inside of your body. I mean, he talks about nuclear dust. I don't understand why people aren't listening to one of the key negotiators for the JCPOA. He was the Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz. He is a Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicist, and he's trying to say the obvious, which for some reason or other nobody in the press seems to be picking up on, which is that 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium at 60% that the Iranians have, you can make bombs out of that. And A.Q. Khan sold the Iranians blueprints for the Chinese Hiroshima-style nuclear HEU bomb. And by the way, the HEU bomb that the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima was not tested, one, and two, it wasn't at 90% enriched. So, when you talk about this idiot Hegseth saying, you want them to get a bomb? Well, in a way, they already have the bomb. The real issue is how you get it out of their hands. I mean, we're deeper into this thing than people realize.
Yeah, and the other issue, which I guess sort of we don't really discuss anymore because the train has left the station. But the fact that this had been done without the authorization of Congress, even either before the strikes or even after the strikes, which is also permissible under the War Powers Act, is really frustrating and really alarming. The idea that the law does not apply and that the president seems to be able to get away with this. And today, in his testimony before the Senate, Hegseth said that it was the understanding of the administration that the ceasefire stopped the 60-day clock, which I believe runs out tomorrow, in terms of needing congressional authorization or another 30-day extension. And so this interpreting the laws that are there to constrain the president and what he can or can't do without any checks and balances seems to have been just pushed into the past and ignored, if you want to talk about things that people aren't paying attention to.
So just in closing then, Karen, is this a case of that Trump, as I mentioned earlier, this is Trump's maniacal misadventure, and we're all paying the price, of course. But is this the only way to end him? In other words, the Democrats will come back in November and be able to put some checks and balances on him, because obviously the Republicans have completely abdicated their responsibility in terms of separation of powers, even though, by the way, when King Charles just spoke to the joint session a couple of days ago, they rose to their feet with a rousing applause when King Charles talked about Magna Carta and the need for the separation of powers, which the Republicans have completely abdicated on.
Yeah, no, I thought that speech was quite telling, both in its combination of directness and subtlety was really quite artful. And But if you're asking me, how is this going to stop? Yes, the elections will help, and things are not looking good for the Republicans right now. It also seems that some Republicans may eventually understand just how damaging this is, both in terms of for their futures because of their constituencies and how struggling Americans are in terms of affordability, but also how opposed to this war Americans are. So who knows what can happen between now and then, but right now we're at a place where it seems like waiting till November is a long time.
Well, I had a guest on recently, Bruce Fine, who said that he thinks the turning point will be May the 19th, which is the Kentucky primary, where Trump is trying to knock off Tom Massie, who is an irritant to him. Yeah. And that will be the test. In other words, Trump has put up a lot of money and a candidate to primary Massie, and that's his hold over the Republicans, like a mafia boss. If you cross me, I'll put you out of business. So Bruce thinks that will be the key test. And if Massie wins, then that will free up the Republicans to free them from the terror they have that Trump will primary them. What do you think of that scenario?
I'll take any scenario that seems to be predictive of a more constructive, engaged, realistic future. But now so I can't wait till May 19th to see what happens. So thank you for that.
And again, I thank you for joining us here today, Karen Greenberg.
Thank you so much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Karen Greenberg, who is a future security fellow at the New America Foundation and the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump. We're going to take a brief station break and back and go to Kyiv, Ukraine, to discuss how yesterday Trump checked in with the boss in an hour-and-a-half phone call with Putin.
So the general has a purge. He wants to win elections with the certain satisfaction.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now from Kyiv, Ukraine, is Tamar Jacoby, who is the director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page. And she is the author of Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience, and has an article at the Washington Monthly, The U.S.-Europe Rift, How Trump's Iran War is Making It Worse. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tamar Jacoby.
It's great to be here, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Tamar. And yesterday, Wednesday, Trump checked in with the boss and had an hour-and-a-half phone call with Putin, after which Trump then called for pulling out U.S. troops from Germany. He's obviously upset with Chancellor Merz, who said that the Iranians were humiliating the United States in the Persian Gulf. But it's pretty hard not to see a connection there. I mean, here he is, he talks to Putin, who, by the way, is supplying intelligence to kill Americans in the Gulf. And then he turns around and wants to pull American troops out of Germany, which is clearly high on Putin's wish list. So at what point do you think the American people or in the MAGA world or the Republicans in the House and Senate, how can they avoid recognizing the obvious?
Yeah, I mean, I do share your view that it's deeply troubling. I mean, does Trump really not understand that Russia and Iran are the closest of allies, and that Russia has been that Iran has been supplying Russia with drones and other weaponry for these 4 years, and as Russia fights the war in Ukraine. The most common really drone in use here is the Iranian Shahed. Russia has shot something like 70,000 of them at Ukraine over the past 4 years. And now, as you point out, since America started the conflict in Iran, Russia's been supplying Iran with targeting intelligence, how to hit American assets around the Persian Gulf. And yet, here's Trump having a cozy chat with Putin, even as the war technically in Iran technically continues. I mean, it defies explanation, imagination, any term you want to put on it. And you and I speculated about this many times. What is Putin's hold over Trump? And there are many theories. We don't have to go there again, but it's clearly troubling. Whatever the reasons for it, or whatever the cause, whatever the roots of it. From the point of view of Ukraine, they had this conversation, and I mean, there were again many dizzying aspects. The first thing was Trump completely garbled what was Ukraine and what was Iran. A reporter asked him a question, and he answered, "Well, Ukraine has clearly been defeated," and he went on to talk about that, and it turned out he was really talking about Iran. Can he not tell the difference? Like two big countries far away. What? He's the president. He's fighting a war in one of those countries. And then Putin clearly, apparently, suggested a, a brief ceasefire for May 9th, which is the day that Russia celebrates the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany. And Trump comes away saying, "Oh, we're going to have a ceasefire in Ukraine." And first of all, it's only even if it happens, it would only be allegedly a 1-day ceasefire. And second, there have been numerous 1-day, 2-day, 3-day ceasefires, so-called ceasefires declared by Russia in the 4+ years of the Ukrainian war, and Russia never observes them. A ceasefire is a request for Ukraine to stop fighting, but Russia isn't going to. So I don't, Trump. It would be laughable if it wasn't sort of troubling. And I mean, all you can say, really, the bottom line is that Putin has snowed him again. Trump has come away thinking that Ukraine is losing and that Russia wants peace and that, America should impose a bad peace on Ukraine. And that is deeply troubling.
Well, what's ironic, though, is that just a couple of days ago, in a joint session of the House and Senate, where King Charles addressed the U.S. Congress, Charles got a standing ovation when he called for continued support for the heroic people of Ukraine. And, I mean, the Republicans jumped to their feet. So privately, they obviously want to support Ukraine, but publicly, they've got to go along with Trump, who has this peculiar hatred of Ukraine and Zelensky. So it's again an example of the amazing cowardice of the Republicans in the House and Senate, with the exception, by the way, of Mitch McConnell.
Yep, I saw his piece.
Who wrote the piece in the Washington Post, basically excoriating Elbridge Colby, saying, "Why are you holding up $400 million that we've already appropriated for Ukraine?"
Yeah. Well, and then there was J.D. Vance. I mean, yes, to all your points. I mean, it was amazing, that standing ovation. There's plenty of support for Ukraine in the U.S. Congress. Why no one dares? What happened to that bill that had 80 plus co-sponsors, Lindsey Graham's bill to put tougher sanctions on Russia? What happened to that? Like that, it sank without a trace. So you're right. It's another example of Congress's cowardice, Trump's crazy hold on the American public debate. I was very disturbed to see J.D. Vance boasting the other day that the cutting off support for Ukraine was his proudest moment as vice president. It's the thing that he's done as vice president that he's most proud of, is to deprive Ukraine of ammunition, and American ammunition and weaponry. So I don't know that there's, what's the answer here? I don't think there is much of an answer. It's really Europe's war now. The American, the second American ambassador in Kyiv resigned last week or this week. The second to resign in 6 weeks, or 6 months, rather, excuse me, in 6 months. So we're sort of out of the game here now. We still provide intelligence that matters, although France is increasingly replacing us in that realm. And we still make Patriot interceptors, which are those important missiles American missiles that can shoot down Russian ballistic missiles. And at the moment are still the only weaponry that can do that. Trump rightly describes it. He says it's like a bullet hitting a bullet. This Patriot interceptor hits the Russian ballistic missile and it incapacitates it. And Ukraine desperately needs them. I mean, they're ballistic missiles aimed at my apartment, several times a month. And Ukraine needs the ammunition to shoot them down. And so that's America's main role in Ukraine now, and it's a very important role. But, we can only hope that sooner rather than later, either Ukraine or a European country develops the technology to help Ukraine, without relying on Patriot interceptors. I mean, the other thing to note about Patriot interceptors is over the course of a 4-year war, America has provided about 600 for Ukraine. In the first 2 weeks in Iran, we exploded to 800. And it's a limited supply. So in a way, America's getting out of that game too, just by the supply. So, I can imagine in 6 months, America having no role in Ukraine virtually. And then it will be Europe's war. And, the big question will be, can Europe carry it?
Well, haven't the Europeans finally figured out that that's a waste of time placating Trump? I mean, you can give him gold statues and rewards like the FIFA crooks did, and you can grovel to him like Mark Rutte has tried. But at the end of the day, surely they got to understand where this guy really is and where his sentiments are, because Trump, after his hour-and-a-half phone call yesterday with Putin, said, "Oh, we had a very good convocation. I've known him a long time." And I mean, what does that mean?
We don't want to know, I think, or, we'd be horrified if we knew exactly what that meant.
Right.
But I think, I do think increasing numbers of Europeans and European leaders understand who Trump is and what the difficulties are. And, we've seen increasing however long it's been that Trump's been back in the White House, not quite 18 months. At the beginning, there was a lot of flattery and a lot of yesing and, what do you need, Mr. President? And there's increasingly less and less of that. And, look at somebody like Merz. I mean, Merz came in trying all he could to being skeptical of America, but trying to maintain the friendship. And the trouble is, that the U.S. still needs Europe, as we saw in the war in Iran. We needed those bases, and we, in the end, did use those bases, despite a lot of public fussing about it. And Europe still needs America for big pieces of its defense. It is building up its own arsenal, and it is trying to take over some of those capabilities. But after, really an 80-year marriage, it's hard to get divorced overnight. And both sides would be in trouble if they had an overnight divorce. And so in many ways, I think Europeans are increasingly clear-eyed about America and what it means to have a strategic partnership with us. But they're tied in the bad marriage. They're sort of stuck in the bad marriage for now. And so, Rutte handles it one way, flattery. Others handle it other ways. But it's what's problematic, what's worrisome to me, actually, the most worrisome thing of the current moment is that the higher oil prices resulting from the Iran war are hitting Europe really, really hard. I mean, it's hard to take an airplane now. The jet fuel is just priced, in the sky, literally, bad metaphor. But who's going to get blamed for that? But the centrist leaders currently in power who are already challenged by populists. And I think we're going to see a big growth in populist support in the coming months. And let's just hope it sort of peaks before the elections that count in France and other countries. But I'm worried. And so, for now, Europe is really charged with carrying Ukraine. But, what happens if the consequences of Trump's recklessness mean that none of those leaders or fewer of those leaders are in power in a year?
Well, I think the opposite will happen here. People are mad about the gas prices, which have reached a peak. Brent crude went up to $126 a barrel today, or at least it peaked at $126 a barrel. I think the opposite will happen. There'll be a swing to the left in November, assuming we still have elections and Trump doesn't figure a way to use the Insurrection Act on the rubric that, oh, we're at war. Because his options in Iran aren't particularly good. Either
They're not.
a suicidal attack on the Strait of Hormuz or a long blockade, which will mean the price of oil in the global economy will tank and the price of oil will go through the ceiling.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. But I agree. I think the options are not good. And somehow now Trump is going to have to, fake and bluff and bluster his way to a worse situation than he had before he invaded, or whatever he did, started bombing. And I think he's going to have to. I think he's going to have to accept that, with a lot of bluster to cover it up. And I just hope that I hope that the Iranians have enough of an incentive to unblock the strait that the oil starts flowing again. But the consequences are rippling around the world in very frightening ways.
So, just in the last couple of minutes, it seems as if the Ukrainians are actually having some success at striking back at Russia, who's had a long campaign to destroy Iran's energy infrastructure. And they've been very successful at it. But now there's been a strike on an oil facility deep inside Russia at Perm. That's at 900 miles from Ukraine. And daily...
Yeah, so the Ukrainians are doing pretty well. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, go ahead. I mean, they seem to be... That's why Putin has called off the military parade in Red Square on May the 9th.
Yep. No, I mean, for years, Ukraine pleaded with the West to be able to get permission to use Western long-range missiles, and we wouldn't give it to them. Germany wouldn't give it to them. America was had a lot of conditions, and but there are things we wouldn't give them. And so the Ukraine defense industry, invented its own. I mean, some of them are drones, some of them are missiles, but you're right. They're having a big success, hitting mostly, Russia's been targeting mostly civilians, trying to cut out the energy system to hit civilians. I think Ukraine is more focused on damaging the energy system that supplies the troops, but they've had quite a significant success hitting oil tankers, hitting oil refineries, hitting oil pipelines. It's not been enough to cripple the Russian, oil business, but they're having success, and it's people are finding it. It's very good for morale in Ukraine. That's all we can say. But is the war going to end anytime soon? I fear not. I mean, that's the trouble. Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is having a good month, and let's hope Ukraine has a good summer. And let's hope Europeans can carry the day. But I don't see Putin giving up anytime soon. And I certainly don't think Trump's peace plan is an answer. So I think there's a long war ahead, and it's not yet clear what is going to make the difference with Putin, if anything ever does.
Well, there is some evidence that maybe what will make the difference is an economic collapse in Russia. The Russian economy contracted by 0.03% in the first quarter. There's all kinds of, it's hard, of course, to get a real reading on it, but there's all kinds of rumors about a pending economic collapse. But just in closing, what do the Ukrainians make of the fact that their Jewish president is always insulted by Netanyahu, to the point now where the Israelis have imported stolen Ukrainian grain from the Russians, and they're basically telling Ukraine to get lost?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, Ukrainians don't care about that very much. They're not focused on it. They're not, this was a Soviet place for so long that in a way that kind of religious sectarian category is not that important here. But I think in the bigger picture of the war, I think you're right. I mean, it's true always in history, right? Sort of stalemated wars of attrition are stalemated until something happens. And one big thing that could happen in this circumstance is that the Russian economy collapses. I think that right now that's the biggest hope on the horizon. And again, I think the point is you can't see what's coming around the corner, even in a long stalemated war. And so Ukraine has to keep fighting, and let's hope Europe can do its part to help. And that's where there's nothing to say but that, really.
Well, Tamar Jacoby, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Tamar Jacoby, who is the director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page. And she is the author of Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience, and has an article at the Washington Monthly, The U.S.-Europe Rift, How Trump's Iran War is Making It Worse. And she joined us from Kyiv, Ukraine. We're going to take a brief station break and back with an assessment of the second day of Secretary Hegseth's testimony, this time before the Senate Armed Services Committee.
Птах в небесах безпілотником вітру шукає знов, світить в тумані вікно, тиша примарна, фрази короткі, безвість не чутно течуть, серце надії печуть, що все не марно, десь там ти мене ждеш, мамо, як від грими.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Tom Mockaitis, a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European, and military history. His research and writing covers international security, terrorism, and conventional conflict, and military history. A regular contributor to The Hill, he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as part of the United States Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and is the author of many books including New Terrorism, Myths and Reality, and Violent Extremists, Understanding the Domestic and International Terrorist Threat. And he has a recent article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tom Mockaitis.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And today, Secretary of State, or as he likes to call himself, Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And, of course, yesterday he testified before the House Armed Services Committee, during which he made a pitch for an extra $1.5 trillion. But in making a pitch to the Congress for extra money, he insulted the Democrats and some Republicans, saying that they were reckless, feckless, and in effect aiding and abetting the enemy. How did he do today?
Well, I think he clearly, the thing to remember about Hegseth is that he has an audience of one. He's really speaking to Donald Trump, and it's concerned about how he comes across. I'm sure that he was advised to go a little bit more softly. He's not all over the newspapers. He hasn't apparently called them names, and he may perceive them as a more friendly audience. Hard to know. But he didn't learn from Trump. He's cut from the same bolted cloth. Bully, cajole, and just see if you can get what you want. And it works for Trump. I don't think it'll work for Hegseth. And the other thing is, he would do well to remember that the last two people who got into trouble in congressional hearings were Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi, both of whom were gone. So I would not put it past the president to say, well, one of the ways I can kind of get out of this bind in terms of being blamed is to say, well, Secretary of State Hegseth, really hasn't done what I expected in Iran, and time to get somebody else. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens.
Well, one of the main topics today before the Senate Armed Services Committee was the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which sets a 60-day limit on introducing U.S. forces, boots on the ground, in hostilities without congressional authorization. So I think the deadline is actually tomorrow, if I'm not sure, Tom. So Hegseth tries to get around this by saying, oh, no, it's not 60 days because we're in a ceasefire now. So he thinks he's bought some more days. Are the senators going to buy that? I mean, the War Powers Resolution of 1973 is pretty straightforward.
I think they probably will buy it because they've shown no willing. I mean, someone said it's really remarkable that here we are. It's not until day 58 and now day 59 that they've made any attempt to even appear to justify this war to Congress, which has had no, what apparently wasn't even consulted about it. And they, as far as the technicality, yeah, I think that the majority will take that as cover and avoid bringing this to a head. But the thing they can't fix is the economic crisis, which is really starting to bite not only the American public, but also causing great worry among the Republicans for the fall election. People are now talking about a global recession if we don't get the straits opened and get the oil moving again, as well as fertilizer and other commodities.
Well, today at the White House, there was a briefing in the Situation Room by the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, along with the Trump's national security team, such as it is. And he apparently offered up plans prepared by CENTCOM, one of which includes short and powerful strikes intended to force Iran back to the negotiating table. I'm told that the plan would be to pound the Iranian coast around the Straits of Hormuz and maybe even send in the Marines. That seems pretty risky. The other alternative, apparently, is a long blockade, which Trump talked about, even though there's evidence that this blockade is not really working very well. A lot of Iranian ships are getting through. It's pretty amazing, the number that have been getting through. So it's pretty clear that the options aren't very good, in spite of happy talk coming from Hegseth.
That's absolutely correct. And the issue is cutting off the oil. Much of that oil goes to India and China. And the president has a high stakes, high profile trip coming up to China, and he doesn't want it dominated by this. And India, Modi is sometimes called the Trump of India, is someone who's been kind of a close ally. So he doesn't really want to antagonize them either. And so, there are not a lot of good options. They've painted themselves into a corner, and they went into this with not a whole lot of forethought as to what might go wrong. And for that, I have to say a lot of the blame falls with General Kane. Your job as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not merely to lay out options for the president, but to advise him when you think something is not a particularly good idea.
Well, I'm wondering whether Kane's actually at this briefing today by CENTCOM commander, and Hegseth isn't either. So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess Trump probably records all the testimony, and he'll watch it into the late hours tonight to grade Hegseth,
absolutely,
like a school teacher grades a pupil. But I just mentioned the leakage of the U.S. blockade upon the Iranian blockade. Apparently, according to the Middle East Monitor, 52 Iranian ships have breached the U.S. blockade within the last 72 hours. So you've only got 15 naval warships there. There's a lot of ocean there in the Gulf of Oman.
It's also a standoff blockade. It's not a close-in one. But, back to the advice he's gotten. I mean, in fairness, I don't even know. I mean, there were leaks right before the war or right after that Kane wasn't in favor of it. Whether he said that forcefully enough, whether Susie Wiles said it forcefully enough, Tulsi Gabbard, as I understand, may not even have been at the meeting. But you got a president who just really doesn't like to be disagreed with, and he surrounds himself with people who are inclined to say yes or three bags full. And that makes it very, very hard, to get advice through, even if people are inclined to do it. And I'm inclined, and I suspect that they weren't entirely willing to be forthright about that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a close-in blockade is not easy to do, and even with the firepower we have. And then the alternative is, you're really going to sink, neutral shipping tankers. Some of them may be Iranian, but who's carrying the oil? Is it really an Iranian flagship, or as happens all over the world, a ship flying a flag of convenience, which could be owned by any number of actors? Again, there's a major escalation there. So, I suspect, and then there's discussion of, well, we could force open the straits. Nobody sees that as a very good option. Yeah, you probably could, but are you going to convince the shippers and also the insurance companies, which are a big player in this, that the risk is acceptable to let these vessels through with the possibility of them being sunk.
Well, just back on the War Powers Act, Tom, today House Speaker Mike Johnson was asked by NBC News about the 60-day threshold as it outlined in the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And guess what Mike Johnson said? We're not at war.
Oh, this is an incursion or an excursion or something. Yeah, I mean, reality is what the leader says it is. We weren't technically at war in Vietnam. I mean, because it was not a declared war. But I think the whole purpose of the War Powers Act was to prevent that, to close that loophole. But, Congress have been very reluctant to do much. I mean, to do that. And I don't expect them to have the courage to do it here. And what would they do? I mean, how would you enforce it? What would they do? I mean, the biggest control they have right now is the budget. And they'll get Homeland Security funded. They may get ICE, they might get the immigration effort funded through budget reconciliation. I don't see how they can ram through a defense budget without 60 votes. And they don't have them. So I think, that's the biggest hammer they've got. And first of all, it's a bloated defense budget. And second of all, we've just gone through. I think 25 million is actually low. I think
Tom, 25 billion.
Billion. Oh, I'm sorry. Silly me. Probably 25 million in a couple of days or half a day. 25 billion. My mistake. I think that's low. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to count defense spending, and there are ways to hide things that are ancillary costs, which, you can say, well, are not directly connected to the war, but really are. On top of that, our bases in the region have taken a pretty good pounding, in no small measure because the Russians have provided the Iranians with intelligence, and we have some indication the Chinese may have provided them with missiles, and particularly what are called MANPADS, man-portable air defense systems, which is what brought down the airplanes where we had to rescue the 2 pilots. So, this is not looking very hopeful. And now gasoline is the highest it's been in 4 years. And oil is, going up, and it's really not a good situation. And I don't think anyone sees a clear path forward at this point, unless both sides are willing to compromise.
Well, in terms of the funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which has been held up for some time, they did unfreeze that today. So we've had some compromise happened, obviously, in terms of that vote today. But apparently, according to the Atlantic magazine, Vice President Vance has been trying to talk to Trump about the extent to which Hegseth is covering up the losses, the tremendous losses. Those AWACS planes are irreplaceable. There's only a few of them left. I mean, they've been very cleverly targeting expensive U.S. military assets. And obviously, Vance is sort of tiptoeing carefully. But he's also apparently, questioning whether or not the general sort of optimism that's coming from Hegseth is warranted. So what do you think's going on behind the scenes there?
Well, like anyone who is, is an autocrat or has autocratic tendencies, let's put it diplomatically, the president behaves like the alpha male in a pack of timber wolves. He wants everybody around him competing and fawning all over him for his attention. There's a lot of speculation that there's already a sparring match going on between Rubio and Vance as to who is going to be the heir apparent for the 2028 election. And it would not surprise me. And Rubio's, by the way, is invisible, which is truly amazing in a foreign policy crisis. But there you have it. It would not surprise me that there are tensions all over the place. The rumors that came out of the debates on the war is that Hegseth was the only cabinet member in favor of it. Vance was not in favor of it. There was some rumor that Kane wasn't in favor of it, not a cabinet member, obviously chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and that others weren't as well. But Hegseth was gung-ho. And the reason he got that job is that, his bravado and machismo were something that Trump really likes, and he's continued to play that card to the detriment of the service. I mean, they got rid of their best general, General George, it gutted the Judge Advocate Corps, gutted the Office of Civilian Casualty Mitigation. I mean, just all kinds of detrimental things being done. But he plays well for the cameras.
Well, he may end up being the fall guy, though, right?
I think that's very likely. I think Trump, as I said, in both cases, if you look at what happened with Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi, Noem, basically, the minute she said, well, Trump knew about those ads I made, that shifted some of the responsibility to him. And he is never wrong. So what did he do? He very quickly got rid of her. And with Bondi, it had more to do, apparently, with, all of this we don't totally know. There's an element of speculation that she did not make the Epstein file problem go away. But she, too, did not do terribly well during congressional hearings. And she, too, was given a hard time and got into it and did not look very good on that. And I think Hegseth may very well be in the crosshairs again as the person to throw under the bus. It's very clear to everybody that with the president, loyalty goes in one direction. You're loyal to him, but there's no guarantee that will be reciprocated.
Well, Tom Mockaitis, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Happy to do it, and you have a nice day.
Thank you, Tom. Again, I've been speaking with Tom Mockaitis, who's a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European, and military history. His research and writing covers international security, terrorism, unconventional conflict, and military history. He's a regular contributor to The Hill, and he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as part of the U.S. Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and is the author of many books, including New Terrorism Myths and Reality and Violent Extremist, Understanding the Domestic International Terrorist Threat, and he has a recent article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for the daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. You can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
Everything seemed right. Another headline written down in America. The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by 9:30. Who will ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An age-old song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. 4 small boys playing ball in the parking lot. A preacher, a teacher, and the other became a cop. A car skidded into the rain, making the last little one to say, one more light goes out in